on the national housing policy as developed by the new government. So I think that probably you had a chance to see my paper. There are a few copies outside, and some of the main points were actually published on the edge in the form of op-eds. So how to activate the presentation mode here?
Use this one, there's a button here, click down.
Oh, okay. Okay. Here there are my contact details, my website, and my YouTube page. Just a brief outline of what I'm going to discuss today. First of all, and I think that this is something that is usually missing in the conversation at political level on affordable housing, is that the issue of affordable housing needs to be judged and seen at the light of the general cyclical fluctuations that involve the property market. And I find that there is a political attention toward the issue of affordability, and recently a lot on home ownership, while the situation, the critical situation that the property market is encountering, a situation of suffering, is a little bit disregarded. And I believe that by disregarding this phenomenon, we might encounter much bigger consequences than simply looking at the home ownership rate, which in Malaysia is not that bad, 76.3%. Moreover, I will discuss the affordability issue in a more complex way, criticizing the median income method and pointing out how affordability has to be considered as a trade-off between three elements: price, floor, and location. And my final point will be that the low-end segment for developers is not naturally unprofitable, but it is made artificially unprofitable by regulation. So, first of all, allow me to repeat one of the central points of my last 2 years' analysis, is that housing fluctuations often lead to business cycles. So we know that most of the housing crises after World War II led to a general economic crisis. So we have to observe the downturn in the property market with a much closer attention, because the consequences that a crisis in the property market can bring about are much higher than the issue, that are much more heavy than the issue of home ownership rate. And this decline in the property market is both witnessed by a decline in the number of transactions, in the value of the transactions, but also in the price dynamics. While up to a couple of years ago, prices were keeping on growing at an average rate oscillating around 5%, in the past 3 quarters, they haven't grown more than 1.6%. This is a symptom that a cooling down, that a readjustment process is happening in the market. The price dynamic is always a consequence of what is happening in a certain industry. So these signals cannot be ignored, and to focus only on affordability, I believe, is misleading. This is a message that I would like to send out very briefly before going more specifically into the problem of affordability, which is the topic of today's talk. First of all, I believe that affordability is complex. The issue of affordability is very complex and need to be analyzed, taking into account both the demand and the supply side. We cannot focus only on one side. And affordability, as I mentioned before, has to be considered as a trade-off between floor area, location, and price per square meter or per square foot. Focusing only on the ratio between income and price is very limited. Always in the economic discussion, in the policy discussion, when we define what is affordable, we simply find the relationship between median income and median price. But the median price is not the price of housing. The median income is not the income of the people. These are values that, being medians, they don't actually exist in the real situation, in the micro situation. And when we choose where to stay, we don't necessarily look only at the price. Location and size matter together with price. In this perspective, we have to consider that there is a strong correlation between regulation and supply-side elasticity. Supply-side elasticity measures how supply is responsive to price change. And there are plenty of studies demonstrating that the bigger is the regulation, the slower is the response of the supply side, so the developers, toward the stimuli that can come from the demand. And this keep the price high. What does it mean, this, in simple terms? It means that if there is a demand, in example, for affordable housing, okay, or there is a specific demand for whatever product, and the regulation impedes the supply to react fast to these inputs coming from the demand, the result is that prices remain high because the supply cannot fast enough comply with the demand expectations. When there is a shortage of supply, then we have the prices remaining on the high side. And the shortage of supply can be artificially created by too heavy regulations. This is a very important point when we discuss policy. Again, another point on the price-income ratio, which does not take into account location and size. A low PIR does not necessarily mean that houses are affordable. We should ask ourselves why in a certain location there is a good PIR. Might be that is because that location is not interesting. It's a signal of distress. Imagine, I don't know, the Bronx in New York in the 80s. Surely it had a low PIR, but not because houses were affordable, or better, houses were affordable, but because nobody wants to live there, because you risk your life by living there. So looking at simply PIR as a number is meaningless if we don't take into account a wider and more complex perspective. So in my opinion, how should we design a right housing policy? I think that even if it is not a politically appealing choice, the best alternative is to work slowly over time for removing supply-side constraints. So to remove all those regulatory constraints that make the supply less responsive to the demand stimuli. Administrative duties, minimum floor space requirements, limits on design and technology. Minimum floor is a very important point, and I will discuss this in a while, but together with minimum size, we have, in example, what we have just seen in the previous presentation, parks, shops, playgrounds, swimming pool, parking, all these kind of things make the affordable homes less affordable and force developers to make wrong choices. And I will discuss this in a while, because this is very dangerous for the people that we want to protect with the national housing policy. An alternative to this is supporting the demand side, but this is much more expensive for the government, more difficult to implement and monitor, and much more distortive to what is the market reality. Now, I want to go back to this issue of the regulatory obstacles that make the supply less responsive. I already told you how a slow supply response keeps price on the high level. But probably, discussing the issue from a political perspective, the most dangerous consequence of too strict regulations is that indeed we are going to harm those people that we want to help by impeding social mobility. I explain you this in very simple terms. If you have to build an affordable house that has to be big, with the swimming pool, with the parking, with the playground, with amenities and everything, you have to do that far away from the economic heartbeat of the city. You can't do that, I don't know, in Subanjaya or in KL or in PJ. You have to go far away. So in this way, you force those people that you want to help with affordable homes to live far away from where good job opportunities are. So probably, and this actually is a choice that can be made in the market, if the market is actually free, if you are belonging to the bottom 40, let's say, and you are single or you have a small family, you have to be free to choose. Maybe you don't need a 900 square meter house, you accept a 500 square meter house, but if you are closer to transportation or closer to good job opportunities, because by getting a good job, you can one day jump into a 900 square meter house, properly made, not a Ruma Selangor Ku or something like that. So by being too strict on requirement and regulations, we are creating obstacles to social mobility. And this is all the more important in this period in which we are making our mouth full with talk about income inequality, shared prosperity. But income inequality is a matter of fact. That there are poor people and rich people is a matter of fact. What matters from a political perspective, if we want to really help the poor, we don't need to give them subsidies. We have to allow social mobility to happen. So the real point in fighting poverty is to have an institutional framework that allows the people that are poor to become less poor over time. But by being too strict on regulation, on minimum requirements for affordable housing, basically we are keeping the poor poor, because we forced them to live away from where good job opportunities are. So when you design a policy, be aware not only of the good intentions, but also of the unintended consequences. Unintended consequences are always the most difficult part to be judged when you design a policy, but usually are the most important ones to be evaluated if you want to implement a policy that is effective beyond the good intentions. And this is an important point that really I want to stress, because I believe that social mobility is an issue that is more important to address rather than poverty per se. Now, looking at the general issue of ownership rate, in Malaysia is not too bad, 76.3%. Of course, is a medium value, so it presents all the problems that all the summary data presents. But I believe that also we have to help the people to understand that salaries are growing, and are growing faster in this period than prices in particular. So home ownership will become less than an issue over time. In the past 3-4 years, salaries have grown faster than home prices. And I would suggest that a new national housing policy should really be a social housing policy, in the sense that should address really the poor people, not the bottom 40. a policy that addresses 40% of the population is too general, too wide in scope, and cannot reach any target. Because 4% of the population is too kaleidoscopic as a group. It's not uniform. But you want to help with such a high home ownership rate, it's better for you as government to address the real problematic situation. I would say, in example, the bottom 5, those people that really live in bad conditions. Now, I want to add, and this is related also with the issue of the infamous project of building 1 million affordable housing, that the issue here is not planning versus non-planning, okay? But rather, who should do the planning. The local knowledge that is relevant to the success of a community is contextual and at least partially inarticulable, and thus it is difficult, if not impossible, to be transmitted effectively to central authorities. Therefore, while I believe that minimum safety standards need to be guaranteed, the rest of the action, the rest of the requirements needs to be left to the interaction between entrepreneurs and consumers, because in this way we can design something that is really according to market expectation. This is part of a biggest problem. I will explain you this as I explain in general the problem with social planning to my students. I believe that there are two types of knowledge, okay? I'm talking about the project of building 1 million affordable homes. In economics, following in particular one of my favorite economists called Friedrich Hayek, we divide knowledge into technical knowledge and into entrepreneurial knowledge, or the knowledge of the conditions of space and time. What does this mean? This means that all the debate on the government delivering the promise of 1 million affordable houses has gone in the wrong direction. If you read the newspaper, everybody is saying, yes, the government can do, or no, the government cannot do, talking from technical feasibility. But this is not the point. Technical feasibility is never the point of an economic project. You can open a pizzeria without knowing how to make a pizza. The technical knowledge can always be bought, can be purchased. You buy someone that can make a pizza. But you, as an entrepreneur, do not decide, you don't question yourself if you can make a pizza or not. You question if, in that location, at a certain price, you can make a profit out of that pizza that someone else is going to cook. So the whole issue of 1 million affordable housing is, does the market need those houses in that number, with that features, with that location, and etc., etc.? This is an entrepreneurial choice. It is not a technical choice. The technical choice comes later. How do we know if the market needs? In advance, sitting here at the whiteboard, sitting at the desk in every minister, but sitting in the university doing your studies, you will never know what the market needs. The only way to know what the market needs is to be in the market, because it is in the market that information is dynamically produced and communicated. And how it is communicated? It is communicated via prices. Prices cannot be decided on the table, because on the table are meaningless. They can exercise an economic function if they arise indeed in the market, because arising in the market, they synthesize billions of individual inter-evaluations and interactions. You got the point? So let the experts, and in this sense not the technical experts, but the entrepreneurs, do their job. As government, you will never be able to know what the market needs. Not this government, not the old government, not the new government. No government, no pool of experts sitting in any university. None we at Ideas know what the market needs. This information can only be discovered in a dynamic way. Therefore, any attempt to plan this situation in advance, 1 million affordable houses, 500,000, 2 million, 3 million, 10 million, is meaningless, is destined to fail. Not only because the government can or not have the money or the technology, that is not the point, but because cannot have information. We keep on saying that we live in the information era. Information is key, is the only key. But that information is not written in books, is only discovered in the market. And the market exists only as a dynamic process, doesn't exist as a diagram on a piece of paper or on a book. And I say that as an economist. Our textbooks are full of diagrams. When I meet my students, I always tell them, take this diagram and throw it away. Because we economists, since long, have forgotten that economics should deal with reality, not with diagrams. And this same argument applies to the focus that you can find in the national housing policy on disruptive technology. The government plans to incentivize and is welcoming new technologies for making homes more affordable. Again, this is a good sign. We need new technology, but that technology doesn't come out of the mind of the technical experts, come out on the market. It's in the market that we know if a technology is sustainable. The technology can be green, can be good, but can be totally unsustainable. So let the market decide it. The state is not an entrepreneur. Okay? And I think Dr. Mahathir emphasized this, launching mixed signal, but is aware that state is not an entrepreneur. So again, my policy proposals can be summarized as in first of all, remove all the distortions from the supply side. I believe that the affordable segment is artificially and not naturally unprofitable. So we have to remove those regulatory burdens that make the supply side less responsive to demand pressure and allow the supply in the market to meet the demand. And this is a very important, because this is the biggest, the biggest distortion, the biggest problem from the supply side. We have to remove government competition. Private developers will never step into affordable market as far as the government is building affordable housing. The government is not working for the market, is not working on market prices. So as far as we have 20 or 6 or 3 or 40 agencies building affordable houses, developers will lack the basic incentive to deliver sound projects, and the basic incentive is profit. Again, new technologies or processes of creative destruction, as Schumpeter was used to call them, are welcome, but they can soundly arise only in the market, cannot be planned in advance. What the government can do from this perspective is to further push toward a pro-business environment, remove those obstacles that avoid entrepreneurial freedom, and eventually being proactive with fiscal incentives for delivering new technologies. Finally, I would like to spend one word on the rental market. We have discussed about rent-to-own schemes, and briefly, I would like to mention something that I believe to be a cultural change happening in Malaysia. This is more part of cultural studies, so it's something that is usually disregarded by economics, but I think we have to bring back cultural study into our realm. The present generation, so now we have all the discussion that the young people can't afford a home. From a European perspective, I think this is quite normal. None of us at 25 was expecting after graduation to be able to buy a house. In Europe, it's quite normal that buying a house is something that happened after a few decades of hard work and saving. Okay, probably, and not when you still have to pay for your PTPTN loan, yeah? And adding up loan on loan and leaving debts to your grandchildren. But I believe that in this specific moment, the new generation in Malaysia is facing pressures from two different cultures. The culture from the parents, the grandparents, that is buy house as soon as possible, because that is security, okay? And the new mentality, which is more present-oriented, less future-oriented, which is be free of traveling, getting job opportunities abroad, go and study abroad, enjoy holidays as much as possible, visit new things. Now, I'm not here to say that the old is right or wrong, or the new is right or wrong. Simply, there is a change. A change is happening and might take 2 generations to be completed, and we have to deal with that. Unfortunately, the people, let's say in the 30s, now here in Malaysia, live this cultural opposition between these two tendencies, and they will have to choose. You can't have both. You can't buy a house as soon as possible, but also be mobile and traveling and having 3-4 days of holidays. Simply can't. We live in a world of limited resources. Our salaries are all limited. Everything is a trade-off. A choice brings consequences. So there is a big discussion about financial literacy. We should tell to the people that they have to choose. What do you want? You want to enjoy life, or you want to build security for your future? It's up to you. As a parent, or I can eventually suggest a direction, but then freedom first. Freedom with consequences. We always pay for our choices. So if for 15 years you have enjoyed it 4 or 5 holidays per year, then you can't complain that you don't have money to buy a house. Okay? So this is a cultural thing that needs to be further explored, I believe, but might be an interpretative key on what is happening in the rental market today. Secondly, I believe that the government can play a role in the rental market, and by renouncing to be a developer, okay, which is not the function of the government can play a social role by creating guaranteed rent schemes for the people that really need to be supported on rent, because the whole point is not affordable ownership, but affordable shelter. There are people that even can't afford to rent a place, and there, for this niche group of people, thanks God in Malaysia is a niche group of people, the government can play a role, helping the ones that are really poor, helping supporting rental schemes, possibly in situations that are not ghetto situations, but in between different kind of development, interacting with the private developers and supporting the developers by paying the rent for those people that can't afford even to pay the rent. This would be financially less burdensome for the government, and moreover can become less and less burdensome as far as we allow social mobility to happen. Because once people can actually improve their situation, they are no more living with the government support. So in this sense, looking at the national housing policy, I think, is where the government should think to go, rather than keeping on thinking to be a developer in competition in a different market segment with the developers. Let entrepreneurs be entrepreneurs, and act as a social helper in the situations of real need, in the less financial burdensome possible situation. For today, for me, that's all. So, because I wanted to leave some space for the discussion. Yeah, Daniele?
Okay, I have a few points. I am a very practical man. I am the market,
Yeah.
somehow.
Yes.
I have been working and studying first and working later in real estate for 35 years. Allow me to say, what is a rental? You have been saying that the change, the cultural change that is ongoing, somehow sees a lot of young millennials, young adults, looking more to rental instead of purchasing a unit, purchasing a property. But if these people are approaching the primary market, that is what I'm teaching in all my articles, publications, and talks, and approach primary market and developers with the same amount that they are spending on every month rental, they can easily repay their mortgage. That is the balance point. Renting a unit, you are paying someone else's mortgage, which to me doesn't make any sense. With a big dislike from the side of investors. Okay, I'm one of them. I have plenty of units and I have plenty of young people renting my unit and paying my loans. So I'm very happy. I'm very, very happy of this. We need the government, in any case, to be in the knowledge of actual demand. I 100% agree with you. I've been mentioning before you came in, is a time for Malaysia to stop talking about B40, M40, top 20. We should be talking about top 20, at least, top 20, bottom 20, and middle 60. If we go further, we go into a bottom 5. Fully agree with you. It's time for the government to come in with social housing. We were discussing that this morning. Government for affordable homes, say the 200,000, 800,000 ringgit value, government there needs to be the regulator. Developers, the market. If we are where we are, it's not because of the developers, of the government's fault. Mostly is because of developers' fault. They have been not listening to what the market was asking and keep on producing what we were discussing earlier, super lifestyle building, very expensive, which initially were purchased and now are hanging there totally empty and partially unsold. Developers are not listening, but still keep on launching further projects of high-end luxury properties where the government should be stopping them, but the government is not acting. So if we talk about the policy on affordable housing, government is the regulator. They must have the information and must have the correct information first. To be able to say, I approve your housing scheme or I reject your housing scheme. So that in future we will avoid to have, we have almost 42% of overhanged units and unsold units in the category of 300,000 and below. You go and look where the majority of these 42% are, 42% of 135,000 homes, properties, which is a big number. Below 300,000 means, oh my God, there is no demand for affordable, right?
Yes, indeed.
But there is. Point is that 42% is in the middle of the jungle. 90,000 are units started and not completed by Feller. In the middle of nowhere where there is no public. The government needs to start being the regulator. And I agree with you. Keep out of the business of being an entrepreneur. Let the developers do the business. Providing as a regulator, I have a long cane in my hand, and I can bang the hand of the developers.
Yeah.
My comment.
Yeah, briefly, on the issue of renting, I agree with you. Of course, it's a matter in the market. It's always a matter of trade-off. You might choose if more or less the loan price is like the rental price. You might choose to go for a loan if you have the down payment amount.
Primary market, no need. Developers are giving it
Yeah,
free.
but this is very dangerous because this might lead to a subprime situation. I believe that with non
Been there for 20 years.
but I believe that if we allow and consider we are then every country is specific. Malaysia is a country in which the household debts on GDP is 82%. So I'm quite skeptical on too loose credit terms in a country in which it's difficult. But this is an economic problem. Then there is a cultural problem in which you might choose to rent not simply because of price reasonament, price considerations, but also because of mobility. You say, now I'm here, but I don't know, my aim is to be in the US, to apply for a job in the US, or to go to Taiwan, to China, to Australia, whatever. So you don't want to be trapped into a loan because you want to allow yourself. But these are very subjective consideration, and I think that this need for mobility is probably arising more in the new generations than what it was in the old generation. So that then, of course, I'm quite conservative. I'd like to buy a house, but here the government is too expensive in its institutional framework for me. I live in Selangor, and for foreigners there is a threshold of 2 million.
I can teach you how.
Then on the issue of the market, the developers, I agree with you. In my paper last year, I described precisely how the overhang was the result of wrong entrepreneurial decisions, which are partially unavoidable in a business cycle dynamic. So I believe that somehow that fever that happens in a certain industry at a certain extent can't be avoided. Then I also believe that certain developers are keeping on building for reasons that we cannot say, okay, and we cannot really explain.
Can say if someone knows, but there is no reason.
And then I agree on the fact that the government should provide an adequate, what we call the institutional framework. So that is the main task of the government, to take care of the institutional framework, having a pro-business approach, to be able, and that indeed is the message hidden in the initial part of my presentation when I say rather than focusing only on affordability, we should look at the general condition on the property market, because that conditions are might be much more risky than all the discussion on affordable housing, because if a Europe-like situation, let's say, happen, and might not happen, but if going to happen, that the consequences are much heavier than every other consideration on affordable housing. Institutional framework is important, but knowledge, the actual knowledge of the market conditions is impossible to gather in advance because it's dynamic, in particular for situations like housing in which projects are long-term investment projects, which take the demand today, the situation of the demand today might be completely different of the situation of the demand in 10 years. So the regulation and the framework need to be also quite flexible and not necessarily punitive. What I say also to journalists is when they say maybe the government should help the property market, then I say no. There are entrepreneurial mistakes. If you are doing mistakes selling nasi lemak, the government doesn't come to help you. So why should help entrepreneurial mistakes on the property market? So this is not the role of the government. Try to create an institutional framework in which the possibility for mistakes is limited, but mistakes happen, and we have to have, so in example, in a case of a crisis, I believe that the government, rather than addressing developers and banks, should address the borrowers. So in a case of a situation, Europe-like situation would happen, the government should focus on saving the people rather than the banks.
Yeah. Hopefully will. Hopefully will. Talking briefly about the market situation, real estate situation, to me is not as bad as they painted, basically, because we are talking about a real issue about over 45,000 homes, wrongly constructed. Brother, keep it in your cupboard. Sooner or later someone will buy it. Quantity-wise is a very small portion of what the market size is. So that is absorbable, kind of.
Yeah. Okay.
They can digest it. Main issue in Malaysia, I was saying it in my talk this morning at the end, land matter is a state matter.
Yeah.
Federal cannot argue.
Yeah.
This is the biggest challenge of Malaysia, to sort out in a conducive and proper way the problem of affordable housing supply. Because federal can give directions. Follow, not follow is up to the state. And we know where we are at the moment. Hopefully there might be, there should be, there will be a small change in this, I don't know how, honestly. But we need to have a central regulator issuing frameworks, issuing guidelines, issuing minimum, maximum, and very strict and enforced rules.
Enforce and control. Once you implement a policy, you need to be also sure that you know to control the evolution. There is some other question from the floor.
Was it becoming
A dialogue.
Economist discussion.
Yes.
Please.
Doctor, my question is talking about government roles, imposing regulatory. For me, the way you say it, contribute more on the problem of providing the so-called affordable house. Can you give us the example, the regulatory which become a challenge to the housing industry in providing the affordable house?
The minimum size requirement, in example.
Minimum size.
Minimum size and the parking lots and all that kind of things that are facilities make the supply side more reactive, but slow responsive. But my main point was on impeding social mobility, because the issue needs to be looked from a wider perspective. One perspective is by being too strict on regulations, you make the supply less responsive. First point, and this keep the price high.
Example? Can you give an example? Because you see,
in example, if the approval of the
Ministry of Local Government Housing Sarawak.
Okay.
So my main task is issuing license to housing developers.
So be sure that the
regulatory
process
part is on my part. So when we come up with all the policies, the rules, at the back of our head is about protecting the interest of housing purchasers.
yes.
So how come when we come up with certain policies and regulatory, on the other side saying that this thing contribute to the cost of the construction,
Yeah.
whereas we in the government thinking of, we try to protect the housing purchasers' interest, being the government.
Yeah.
So I think the other day I'm discussing with one developer. He also mentioned the same thing. He said every time you introduce a new requirement, new regulatory, it will be a compliant cost.
Yeah.
And the word that he said, we will transfer this thing 100% to a housing purchaser.
Of course.
So for me, if it's 100%, can you share it? Why you have to transfer 100% to the housing purchasers? And at the end, you said, blame the government, because government asked us to do this.
Yeah.
So for me, being government officer and those who involved in coming up with the policy, quite unfair to say that.
Okay.
Quite unfair. Your comment, please.
I have in mind in particular all the processes of approval, all the things that need to be the procedures that need to be done in order to implement a project. The slowest it is, the more complicated it is, but also the more changeable it is, because if you are used to deal with a certain framework for certain procedure to start a project, and then these rules keep on changing, add-on, removal, then you might do new studies, okay? You might make new business plans. You need to revise completely your choices. This makes your production process slower, and this makes the response to the market slower. Then when you say you charge it to the customer, this is what happens in every industry. If you are producing Asile Mac and the cost of sambal is increasing, you charge the cost of sambal increasing back to the customer. You don't share it. Of course, depends on market conditions in general. But if you have market conditions that allow you to charge back to the customers, you will do that. Not only in housing, in every economic activity, because as an entrepreneur, you stay in the market to make a profit, not to be a charitable institution.
Maybe that is what we call this capitalism. Is all about.
But I've seen that the alternative, where the government tried to provide everything, didn't work that better than capitalism. I've seen that in Venezuela, in USSR, in China, in Cambodia, in USSR, in Cuba, where the government said capitalism is not working and the government needs to provide whatever the people need, and the government decide what the people need, so you are not free to choose what you want to eat, what you want to wear, what you want to earn, which kind of job to do, because the government is taking care. Historically, I didn't see it working that well for the people. Usually finish in a mass murder. Venezuela, they cannot find.
Capitalism is also not so successful.
No, in Italy is not a capitalistic country. A country in which the government takes 70% of your income is not capitalistic.
We're talking about providing house to the people.
Yeah, but this you have to ask yourself: is the task of the government providing houses to the people, or is the task of the government reasoning more on a wider concept that is shelter, not home ownership necessarily? Because there is written nowhere, even in the Declaration of the Human Rights, that people has the human right to own a house. There is written that the people has the human right of a shelter, which is a much wider, and that's why my suggestion of having the government socially involved in helping the very poor people with the rental. Otherwise, if not the home ownership, why should not provide the car ownership? Why should not provide whatever else? This is not what we have in mind.
No, you're saying we don't have any more time. Any other questions?
Okay, finish.
No, he's the organizer.
Oh, yeah, I know. Oh, it's okay.
All right.
Okay.
So, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Ferlito will be around for
Yes,
the
yes.
coffee break. You can interact directly with him. Help me to put our hands together